you're back on News Talk Saga 960 AM. This is the NPH Hour. I'm your host, Jason Thom. I'm also the producer of this show, and that means I get to book the guests and decide on the topics, as long as it relates to basketball in one way or another. So as the news started to break about the unmarked graves being found related to residential schools across Canada, I knew it was something I wanted to include on the platform I have on this show. The first person I reached out to was the most decorated Aboriginal Canadian basketball player ever. Michael Linklater has made history and shattered stereotypes throughout his basketball career. Back in 2010, he helped the University of Saskatchewan win their only national championship by first knocking off the powerhouse Carleton Ravens in the semifinals, then the UBC Thunderbirds in the final. He then went on to become a leader in the Canadian push in 3x3 basketball, becoming a name worldwide due to his trademark style of hard-nosed play, despite being just 5'10". Then, in a perfect storybook ending, Linklater was a member of his hometown Saskatchewan Rattlers when they won the first ever CEBL championship in his hometown of Saskatoon. His career ended on the shoulders of his teammates, celebrating a title in the same arena where he watched an Indigenous player compete in the now-defunct World Basketball League. Being a part of that moment as a broadcaster is something I will never forget. It was something that I could never describe. Special just does not really encompass what that moment meant to Michael Linklater, and being able to see it was amazing. And now, as a leader in his community in his post-playing career, Linklater agreed to come on this show to help educate and inform. As a warning, some of what you will hear may be disturbing, but it needs to be heard. Michael Linklater, former 3x3 star on the World Tour, a member of the inaugural CEBL champion Saskatchewan Rattlers, and a member of the Thunderchild First Nation, which is why I asked him to join me on the NPH Hour in hopes that he can help educate our basketball community on something all of Canada needs to know and understand. Michael, just a very black and white question to start, and I know it isn't a short answer. Can you just explain to everybody out there the residential school system and really why it's in the news right now?
Yeah. The residential school, for a lot of younger viewers that might be listening, the residential school system was created by the federal government as well as the Catholic Church. And what the hopes or what the purpose of that creation was to kill the Indian in the child. And I believe that it was the first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, that was quoted saying that. So the purpose of that was to kill the Indian in the child by assimilating us to become more like mainstream, whatever they wanted. So when we talk about cultural genocide, when we talk about genocide of our people, it was all done through that system of the residential schools. The children were taken at a very young age. If the parents either disobeyed or tried to prohibit the attendance of their children, they were sent to jail, and the children were still taken. So really, there was no choice. They were forced into this. So it was not something that was wanted. And all of our culture, all of our history, and our ceremonies were prohibited. So it's something that even me, as an individual, I still struggle with the traumatic impact that has been passed down. And it's something that Canada is now really starting to listen to, because we're recovering bodies. A lot of survivors told us, they witnessed with their own eyes, they saw the death, they saw the burials. Some of these, hearing the stories of some of the survivors where they were actually digging the graves themselves for their friends. And something, which is, I give a warning here that this is going to be very graphic what I'm going to share. But there was a survivor who shared that when the kids were giving birth from the priests, those babies were being thrown in the incinerator. So there's going to be a lot of bodies that are not found. So it's important to understand that we have protocols that we must follow. And we need to find every child so that we can go through our proper protocols and ceremonies to give them the proper honoring that they deserve.
This is not ancient history. And I think that's what I really want people to understand. In your home province of Saskatchewan, there was a residential school open up until 1996. And although the numbers, which just before we recorded, there's an updated number now today, and this is happening every day. People are shocked by this, but the Indigenous community is not. This is something that you've been dealing with and your people have been dealing with. They knew that this had occurred.
I have a very good friend who's very close to me, and we're a year apart in age, and he attended residential school. So no, this isn't ancient history. It's something that we still continue to deal with and grapple with today. And what a lot of people have shared is not only the stories of residential school and the trauma that and the atrocities that have taken place there, but what they've also mentioned is even right now what the current residential school system looks like, and that's the child welfare system. You know, we have a lot of our kids who are still being taken from our families to this day. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, that image of a residential school no longer exists in terms of the assimilation or the colonization of our people. You know, it's still happening to this day. And I grew up, I was raised, so there's even another component to this as well for my own personal story. My mother was a part of what's called the scoop, the 60s scoop between the early 1960s and the mid 80s, where Indigenous children were taken from their families and they were adopted to non-Indigenous families. So my mother was taken when she was 12 years old, and she was adopted off into the States. And so, yes, the government's had a hand in that. It was their program. So it continued even after residential schools didn't exist, or even while they existed. So this was another component of that. And my mother, because of her trauma, gave me up to my great aunt, and she ended up raising me. And both my great aunt and her late husband were both products of the residential school system. So I was raised by residential school survivors. And the stories that I heard growing up every single day was what we're seeing now and what's coming to light, what the world is now paying attention and listening to. Because what a lot of people don't realize is how racist of a place Canada actually is. I grew up in Canada. I've been living here since I was 10 days old, and it's something that I had to deal with every single day. And where that all stems from, where the racism, especially towards Indigenous people, stems from, is from the residential school system. It stems from colonization. It stems from the genocide of our people. So it's really important that people in today's society understand the importance of the recognition that our people have had and continue to have. When we hear land acknowledgement, when we talk about unceded territory, we as Indigenous people are the original caretakers of the land. When treaties were signed, it was not selling the land, it was of sharing the land. We wanted to help the Europeans who were coming here. We wanted to help them live. And this is my understanding of it. It had nothing to do with selling, because this is not our land to sell.
You initially declined my invite to come on this show because this news was just coming out. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate that now you were willing to come on and talk about this. And I think the biggest thing is, how important is it for this portion of our nation's history to be taught in schools going forward? I had an interest in Indigenous lifestyle and Indigenous rights from one teacher, a grade 4 teacher that when was teaching about the War of 1812 made a point to explain how crucial Indigenous people were in the forming of the country of Canada. How important is it for that to be in our education system here in Canada going forward?
People talk about the history of Canada and what is taught in our current system is history. When we learn about history, what is so important is that we learn the truth about Canada. And this is what's coming to light. Growing up, hearing these stories, but also understanding ceremonies are traditional and inherent way of life, I was very fortunate with that respect. But when I was playing in mainstream world and having these conversations, I was mind blown to run into people who had absolutely no idea, because I grew up thinking it was common knowledge because I had access to those stories and understanding. And it wasn't until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, came to light and provided the information they did through the thousands of residential school survivors that shared their stories. And so with those calls to action, I encourage everybody to read them, to understand them, and to implement them into their everyday life.
You mentioned Indigenous land acknowledgements, and it's something that I've tried to work into just my broadcasting career. Can you explain exactly what that is? Because I feel like public speaking, people are doing it, they say it, and then they move on. But people who are listening, especially younger people, the people who are listening to this show and us on YouTube, can you explain like what that is and the importance of that? And do you feel like it's slowly becoming something that people just have to say rather than actually fully giving it the care that it needs?
Well, there's a couple things to that question. I think the first thing is recognizing the traditional lands that you either live on, that you're either benefiting from, or that you're currently visiting. I'm here in Treaty 6 territory, and in this territory, by acknowledging that and recognizing, what you're doing is saying that no, we weren't the first peoples here. The first peoples here are all of the people that make up Treaty 6. And so before treaties were signed, before settlers came, there were people here. Canada, this land, North America that we refer to it as Turtle Island, wasn't discovered. Well, our people have been here since time immemorial. So when you do a land acknowledgement, you're paying respect to the people who were there long before you. And what I would even encourage Canadians to do is start acknowledging yourself by the generation of Canadian you are. Because we are so quick to say, oh, immigrants this, immigrants that, and they shouldn't be here, they shouldn't be there. Well, you have to remember that you're a descendant of an immigrant. Unless you are First Nations or Indigenous, you immigrated here. So I encourage you to figure out what generation Canadian are you, because we were here before Canada was a country. We were here before provinces existed. And those are the lines that we descend from. So it's important that you recognize that and acknowledge that when you're gathering and paying respect to those peoples. Because when I visit a different territory, just because I'm Indigenous doesn't mean that I have access to that territory. Those are not my original territories. So even myself as an Indigenous person, recognizing the territory that I'm visiting, just like you as a Canadian, you go to somebody's house, that's not your house, but you pay respect to that house in the way you conduct yourself, the way you clean up after yourself, and even the homes that you move into, right? Somebody may have been living there before. So again, having all of this understanding is going to be so important, which also ties into the education system, understanding our true history, the truth of Canada. And it's something that people don't want to talk about.
And obviously this is a show where we talk about basketball, and you're somebody who I know through the basketball world. That's how we met. And I have to think that we can use sport to help the next generation of Indigenous kids. That is a battle in itself for Indigenous people to be able to even play sport. And you've talked about it a number of times that there's athletes on those reserves, and even if they're not on a reserve, Indigenous people that are Olympic level athletes that just need the training and the coaching and the opportunity. What are you doing? What can be done to help with that, to try to ensure that we learn from this history and move forward and try to provide opportunity that has been taken from the Indigenous people for so long?
What your viewers need to be aware of is that since even before Canada was a country, we have been facing oppression. And for generation upon generation, we as Indigenous people have been made to feel unwelcomed in our own homes. When we step onto the sporting field, which is, the great equalizer, when we walk into those doors and we don't feel welcomed, that's where these kids who have phenomenal potential just shut down, because we've been made to feel that we are unwelcome. And I'm speaking from a personal standpoint. There's so many places I've walked into not feeling welcome. And what I do personally is I do my best to make sure that when I see kids coming into a gymnasium, that they feel welcome. I want to make sure that they are excited and happy to be there, and to do my best to help them have a great time. Because once they can fall in love with a game, a lot of things will fade away and they can just focus on being in that moment for that specific time. And it's something that I have grown up with, being able to escape everything that I've gone through when I'm on the basketball court. And it's also provided me an opportunity to gain the respect of my teammates and opponents for not only the work ethic I had put in, but also the opportunity to share with them that I've broken all of the stereotypes. I've never drank a drop of alcohol in my life. And the reason for that was because when I was a kid, I grew up hearing that all Indians are drunks. And a lot of my family struggled with alcoholism. And what I shared before, the reasons why, the trauma that they've suffered, wanting to escape that, even going into these systems and institutions that are there to help. We've seen what the health system has done to our people. We see what the justice system is doing to our people. We see what the policing system is doing to our people. Every single system that's been set up to help, which does help most Canadians, our people are still facing oppression and racism in those systems. So how do we go into those places looking for help when we're not made to feel welcome, when our people are actually dying in these places that are supposed to be cared for? So where do we go for help, right? Where we go for help, we know what we need. We as First Nations and Indigenous people, we know it's our ceremonies, it's our culture, it's our inherent way of life. And that's where we are working hard towards bringing our people back to and helping each other understand. Because a lot of our people have lost that connection due to the genocide, due to residential school system. That was the purpose of residential schools, was to help us, not to help us, sorry, was to force us into the genocide of our identity, to assimilate us to a different lifestyle. So I am very grateful for our ceremony keepers who have hid to keep our ceremonies alive, because they knew we would need it today. And it's something that we cherish and that we hold with very high regard and a lot of respect. And it's quite frankly why I've been very fortunate to be successful in my life. It's because I had my spirituality, I had my culture, my ceremony, but a lot of my friends, my people didn't have that opportunity or weren't fortunate enough. So we know what we need, but we continue to this day, the federal government still oppresses us.
In the current times of social justice and important movements for real change all over the world, I truly hope this is now the time that the Canadian people will force true reconciliation from our government to our Aboriginal people. Now is definitely a time of reckoning for our country, for a history that has been hidden in plain sight for far too long. I implore all of you to read the Truth and Reconciliation Report. It's 6 years old, and once again has been hidden in plain sight by the lack of coverage in Canadian media. There's no easy way to rectify these atrocities. An outright genocide that is now fully coming to light and will continue every day. But the one thing we can all do is pledge to not turn away. Linklater is now focused on helping youth through the game of basketball, which has given him a platform to make a difference and help educate and make others' lives better. As I sign off, I'd like to recognize that I'm recording this show from Treaty 9 territory on the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, many of which still live and work on this land today, and I pledge to treat this borrowed land with the respect and care it deserves. This has been the NPH Hour. I'm Jason Thom. I thank you all for listening here on News Talk Sauga.